Hey everyone, it's Ryan with The Smart House, and before I get started with this week's video, I want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and a joyous New Year. I'm filming this the week right before Christmas, 2021, so if you're watching this later on, then it may not make sense, but that's why. So on today's video, we're going to take a look at how to integrate the SwitchBot devices with Home Assistant. Now, if you missed my last video on how to set up and use the SwitchBot devices, you can find a link in the description below or in the card above. So in that previous video, I set up 4 different devices: the SwitchBot bot, which is the button pusher, the hub, the humidifier, and the meter, which is the temperature and hygrometer. So on this week's video, I'm going to show you the 2 different methods for integrating with Home Assistant. So the first one is the official integration. This uses the Bluetooth on your Home Assistant instance to directly communicate with each of the SwitchBot devices. Now this is nice because it doesn't require a hub and it doesn't require the cloud. However, there's a range limitation which we'll see here later on. The second option is to use the SwitchBot API. Now, this requires a hub and of course the cloud to be functional. So for this one, we're going to be making API commands and converting those into sensors and switches in Home Assistant. So it's a little bit more complicated, but it's, in my opinion, more powerful. Let's jump into the first section, which is how to set up the official integration using Bluetooth on your Raspberry Pi or whatever device you're using. All right, so the first part of this video, let's go ahead and take a look at the built-in integration with SwitchBot. Now, as I said before, this integration requires the device that's running Home Assistant to have Bluetooth radios on board. So if you're running on something like a Raspberry Pi 3 or 4 or an Intel NUC where it's running directly on the hardware, then you shouldn't have any problem getting this to work. But if you're running on a Docker container or you're running on it as a virtual machine, you may run into issues with this particular one because your Home Assistant instance has to have direct control over the Bluetooth radios. So in my case, my test environment is running as a virtual machine, so it's not going to work. So we're going to do this in my live environment. So the first thing we need to do is click on Configuration and go into Devices and Services. Now you may notice that this interface looks different. In the 2021.12 version, they integrated the supervisor and configuration menus into a single menu, and they also added these icons. So everything's sort of in categories now instead of in just the individual items. So for example, now if you're looking for your server settings, like to reboot, you go under settings now, and that's where they are. So if you're looking for the supervisor section, it's now this add-ons, backups, and supervisor. But for today, we're going to go into devices and services, and then go down here to the bottom right hand corner, click add integration, and search for SwitchBot. Now what this is going to do is going to go ahead and search out and find all the devices that it can see. If you get an error message like this, try again. Sometimes the radios are busy. So if we go ahead and open up the SwitchBot app on our phone, find the device that we want to get the information for. So in my case, let's grab the coffee maker information. We'll click anywhere but directly on the button, and then once it finishes loading the information, click the 3 dots in the top right hand corner, and right there we'll see our Bluetooth MAC address. Now this is the device ID that we need to identify which device is which. So when this scan is done, it's going to show all devices that it can see, but it's going to show that Bluetooth MAC address. So this is important. So I would grab each of these for each of your individual devices. Now, if you're like me and you have a bunch of devices connected to a hub, we can find these in a different fashion that we'll do in the next part. So now that we know the Bluetooth MAC address for the device we want, let's go ahead and find the meter, click the gear, and then the 3 dots. And then there's the MAC address for that. All right, so now that we have our device IDs, let's go ahead and click on SwitchBot. And again, it's going to scan for what devices it can see. So while this is spinning, this is actually going to scan out and look for all of your current devices. It just found one of my devices. Now you may notice it's just a Bluetooth MAC address. So now that we've identified that this is my coffee maker, I'm going to go ahead and come back here and type in coffee maker as the name. Now, if you have set a security password for your devices, you'll need to enter it here. I don't have mine secured. This prevents if you set passwords, it prevents somebody from just walking by and connecting to your devices. So it's probably a good idea to go ahead and set passwords for all your devices. So I'll leave the password field blank and click submit. So there it goes. Now it's added the coffee maker. Now if I scroll back down here to the bottom, I find the coffee maker instance, and it's set up 1 device and 3 entities. So if you were to do this for multiple devices, it's more likely going to create more than 1 instance of the SwitchBot integration. So you'll need to just click between those if you want to update the settings. So go to the 3 entities, click on the 1 device. So that's the coffee maker right there. And we can see the diagnostic entities. There's a switch that controls it. Because this is Bluetooth, you may be aware that your device may show offline periodically because it's gone out of range or it's gone to sleep. So just be aware that you may have to wait a minute for this device to initially get set up. When I did this earlier, it took a couple minutes for it to finally show up. If you do notice that your device continuously goes offline, you might need to move it closer or move your Raspberry Pi closer to it. So that's one of the major disadvantages of this particular integration, the distance between your Home Assistant instance and the device. device. And it doesn't seem to have as good of a strong signal as the hub does. So for example, with my hub, the hub is in the center of the house and it's able to talk to every single device pretty much no matter where it is. So you may, if you run into that problem where this integration doesn't work for you, then you might want to pay attention to what's going on. Then you might want to check out the next section where we talk about the hub integration. We've got the switch control, which allows us to activate or deactivate the switch. We've got the battery levels, and then there's also an RSSI that can be enabled. And the RSSI is just the signal level that the Home Assistant instance sees to your device. All right, so in the last step, we saw how we could use the built-in integration to talk to our devices over Bluetooth. Now, as we saw before, that's got some limited range issues, and it's not the most optimum setup in my opinion. If you do happen to have a hub, this next step is going to work much better for you. The hub seems to be tuned better for the devices to communicate. I'm able to communicate over half my house to the devices, so I don't really have much issues with that. So the cool thing is they've released an official API to talk to your devices via the cloud. Now, of course, this particular section requires the cloud to be up, so this requires that everything's fine with SwitchBot, and this also requires that your internet connection is up and running. So some people, that's going to be a disadvantage, and they're going to want to use the local control from the last step. But if you want a little more granular control and you don't want to have to deal with the Bluetooth range issues, this one's for you. So this is going to be a bit more advanced. And if you've watched my previous videos on API, then you'll know that this is kind of what we're doing. We're creating some new devices based on some REST entities and pulling information from the cloud. So if you've missed those videos, click up here to go to a playlist that'll take you through those API videos. They're not required for this one, but I'm going to move a little bit faster in this video. So just be aware, if you do have some questions on how the APIs work, go to that playlist. So a lot of this I adapted from a few different places. All of these references I have in the blog post that is linked here below and on screen. So a couple of the ones I want to point out are the SwitchBot API from Open Wonder Labs. And the other one is a great write-up from Piansky.com. Hopefully I pronounced that right. They did a great blog post on how to set up the curtains, and I've adapted that for my non-curtain devices. So if you do have the curtains, I have a link to his blog post in the description and referenced in the blog post. So if you want to go through and figure out how to do this for the curtains, it's very similar, but his blog post was specifically to the curtain setups, where mine are for the other devices. So all of the code is in the blog post I referenced earlier. So if you just want to copy and paste as we move along and adapt it to your particular environment, I'm going to take the examples that I have in the blog post and paste them in, and then I'll adapt them and show you how they work. And the second thing is we're going to be using a few commands running in terminal. Now in my case, I'm running these in PowerShell on Windows. So I've adapted the commands just a little bit for those syntax. I have some alternative commands if you're running this in just straight terminal on like a Linux machine or Mac. So in this first step, we need to grab an open API key from our SwitchBot app. All right, so let's open up our SwitchBot app. We'll go to Profile, click on Preferences. There's an option down here for app version. Now mine already has already popped out because I've done this before, but if you tap the app version button 10 times, very similar to how it works in the Android operating system, you'll get a new option called Developer Options. And this is where you can click this button to get a token. Now this long token here, I would advise going ahead and copying it to your clipboard and then either emailing it to yourself or sticking it somewhere important. Like I keep mine in my Notion database. This open API key, just like every other API key, will give a user full access to your devices. So make sure you keep that key secret. So now that I've got my key generated, let's go ahead and hop back onto my computer. So here I am in Windows Terminal. And again, these commands I've adapted specifically for Windows Terminal or PowerShell, but you can use the generalized command if you're running this on Linux. So this first command, I'll take you through real quick in depth. We've got curl.exe. So because I'm running on Windows, I have to run curl.exe. Curl, the command, actually runs a different command in PowerShell, so it doesn't work the same way. We're going to have a header, and it's going to be authorization : and this is that API token that we talked about. So I'm going to paste in my API token here, and of course blur it out, paste it in here. Then we have the endpoint, which is https api.switchbot/version1.0/devices. And then this over here just makes the JSON look pretty for my command prompt, so don't worry about that. So what this is going to do is this is going to reach out to the servers and then return back all the devices that are on your account attached to your hub. So you'll notice we have the overhead lights that are in this room here. So the switch that I set up at the previous video, I've got the hub, I've got the meter, coffee maker, and the humidifier. So those are all the devices that I have. And then down here below, you've got the device IDs for all of the infrared remotes that you can set up, that you've set up in the app already. So the first thing we need to do is I'm going to go ahead and check statuses of a device. So let's grab the meter, for example. So I'm going to grab the MAC address for the meter. Let's repeat that same command we just did, but in this case, I'm going to use the endpoint /devices/device ID/status. And there we go. Now we can see information coming from the meter. We see the humidity level and we see the temperature in Celsius. So now we know the two endpoints that we're going to hit to retrieve information. So we're going to need to now go in and set up some code in Home Assistant to allow us to retrieve this information from there. So let's get some basics set up and then we'll do one for each of these devices. So now let's open up our Visual Studio Code. And the first thing we're going to need to do is go into our secrets.yaml and set up a few new secret tokens. So we're going to need a token for the API, which is that long code we had before. And then you're going to need two variables for each of your devices. One being the URL that we looked at before, the status URL, which is the devices/device ID/status. And then you're going to need just a variable containing the device ID. So I've got this set up for each one of my devices. And again, the code is in the blog post to have all that information. So I've got one set up for each of my devices. So that's done. So we'll go ahead and hit save. Then we're going to head over to our configuration.yaml. Now this is where it'll split a little differently depending on how you have yours set up. So in mine, I've got some of mine split into separate YAML files. If you have done that, then obviously put your sensors in the sensor.yaml, put the switches in the switches.yaml. If you don't have that, you can put it in your main configuration.yaml. So I'm going to put it wherever it happens to be for the test environment, but just know that it may look a little different for yours. So the first thing we need to do is go ahead and bring in a REST command sensor. Now we're going to be using this for every single device. So that's why it's coded in the specific way it is. So we can reuse it. We don't have to define one for every one of our devices. So if we look here, we've called the REST command area. We call it SwitchBot device command, define the URL as the first half of that URL, then device ID, then commands. This is going to be a post method because we're actually pushing data to our API endpoint. The content type is application JSON. That's just required. And then for headers, we have a secret, which is that SwitchBot API in our secrets.yaml. Finally, we have the payload for the command, and that is, it's going to put in two templates, one called command, one called parameter. Now this is important because we can actually utilize this in a template switch later on, and then just give those values in so we don't have to repeat this over and over again. So this is pretty efficient, and I did take this directly from that blog post I referenced earlier. So we got the REST command in there. That's all that's required for all of our devices. So that's the general setup. Now let's go ahead and set up specific devices for each of our endpoints. So for the first one, we're going to go ahead and look at the most simple, which is the meter. The meter only has commands that you can pull data from. So we're not actually going to send it any commands because it doesn't actually do anything. So for this, we're just going to use a sensor to be able to pull the information from it. So let's go ahead and grab this example code I have here, and then we'll adapt it. And I'll take you through each of these. Since I already have a sensors.yaml and other platform sensors, then I don't have to redefine it again. So I just add it at the end of my sensors.yaml, or again, if this is part of your configuration, you just add it at the end of that as well. Again, make sure all of your tabs align because that's going to break your YAML faster than anything. So we've got a REST platform. The name is Twins Room Sensor. So the resource is that secret SwitchBot meter status URL, which is that secret we have in our secrets that contains the status, including the device ID that we defined earlier. The method is a get because we're not pushing anything. The scan interval is every 300 seconds, so every 5 minutes. I don't really need this updated constantly, but you can set this down as low as you want. There is a limit on the API endpoints to 10,000 requests every day. It used to be 1,000, but they upped it recently to 10,000. So if you were to ping this sensor every minute, then that would consume about 1,400 of those requests in a day. So you see the number of devices you have, the less number of requests you can make. You also want to leave a little bit of extra in there in case you need to send commands to things like push buttons. So I've got mine set at 5 minutes, 300 seconds. And then under headers, we have that authorization SwitchBot API again, content types JSON, application JSON. And here's where it differs a little. We're going to use a value template. And if you watch my last videos on this, you know that what we have to do is retrieve that data that comes up from the JSON return. So if we look down here, remember, it's always going to be value JSON dot the first key, and since we're nested under there, we have to call for that key. So that first key is called body. So if we look here, so we define the JSON return, which is this value JSON, and we want to pull that first key, body, and then we want to go down to the next level, and that's temperature is what we look for. If you wanted it to display the value of humidity, you could put humidity as the key here, but I'm just going to use temperature. And then we're also going to go ahead and convert this to a float. That way it treats it as a number instead of treating it as a string. This is going to return our temperature from our room sensor. Then below this is a new section that I think was recently added. You've got the JSON attributes. So what this is going to do is this is going to allow you to define the attributes that you want to have in the sensor. So you know you've got the main sensor value, and then you've got additional attributes that are more values that you can reference as well. So a lot of times when you click on the sensor, it has a list of attributes below that. That's what this is. So what we're going to do here is we're going to define additional attributes, and that additional attribute is humidity. So this first tier here says, hey, what's the path for these attributes? Okay, we care about everything under the body path. And since I really don't care about pulling device ID, device type, hub ID, and we already have pull temperature, all I've got left is humidity. So then under JSON attributes, I'm just pulling humidity. So when this sensor comes up, it'll be a value of the temperature in degrees Celsius, and then it'll also give me a percentage of humidity. So everything, the code is ready to go if you want your temperature in Celsius. But if you're like me and you're a dirty American, then you want your stuff in Fahrenheit. So to change it to Fahrenheit, we need to change this variable a little bit. So I'll have both options on the blog post. So in this case, we need to set a variable. So we're going to change up our curly brackets here to allow us to do some math on this. So we're going to take the value we receive and we're going to set it to t. So set it to the variable t, and then directly below that, I guess before that, we need to put in a greater than sign and a dash to indicate we're moving down to the next line to allow us to do multi-line. Then we're going to do curly brackets, take the variable t, and we're going to multiply it by 9/5 and then add 32, which is just the standard conversion factor for Fahrenheit. So we'll go ahead and save that. Let's pop back over here to configuration, go down to server controls and check configuration, make sure we didn't make any errors. Everything looks good. So let's go ahead and click restart. All right, so while this is still starting up, we'll go ahead and go to developer tools and then search for sensor.twins. And there we go. Now we have a sensor with a numeric value of the Fahrenheit temperature in there. And then we've got attributes of humidity. So we have a humidity value as well. Now, if you wanted to customize this, you could go into the code. So if you wanted to set the unit of measure correctly, you could add the variable unit _of _measure. And this is degrees Fahrenheit. So next time we restart it, it'll say degrees Fahrenheit. So that just makes it more complete. So now we have a sensor that can accurately pull out information. And of course, we can reuse this for other sensors that have this information in there. So you'll see when we get to the humidifier, we'll be pulling this again. So when we get to, so we can use this again for other sensors that pull information. So you see us reuse this information later on when we do the humidifier. All right, so next let's move on to the bots themselves. So this will be our first introduction to actually issuing a command that does control. All right, so I'm gonna go a little more quickly because this is gonna be a super long video if I don't. What's required for each of the bots is you need to establish two things. You need to have a sensor to give you the last known state of the device, and then you're gonna need to have a REST command that you can send to tell it to do something. So we're gonna use a switch for that. Now in the case of these switches, one thing you do have to remember is that it doesn't know the absolute position for, say, a light. So if you're in switch mode and you reference the device and it says it's on, that doesn't necessarily mean the light is on, because you can turn the load on and off without affecting where the switch position is. It's just the last known position of your switch. So if you absolutely wanted to know whether a light is on or off, you need to then go ahead and actuate it. So if you want the light on, turn it on, and that'll make sure the light is on. And that way you know you've got the right value. So if you really care about that, you'll have to actually activate the load to get a proper value to know if it's on or off. So since we're already in sensors.yaml, let's go ahead and set up the sensor we need to retrieve the status of it. So again, this is going to be another REST sensor. And if you notice, it looks just like the last one, except for, again, make sure when you copy and paste code, make sure it all lines up correctly. So again, it's a platform REST. We've got, this one's for the office overhead light. The resource is, again, the status URL. It's a get method every 300 seconds, headers, JSON, but we're only using the value template of value JSON body power. So again, if we bring up our PowerShell here and we repeat this command for our office overhead, I'm gonna grab that key. So run that command again, this time with the office overhead. You notice our endpoints are body and power. So the power thinks it's on. So again, we're doing value JSON. First key is body, second key is power. That's going to retrieve either on or off for this device. So that's pretty simple. So to actually move the switch, we got to make a modification to the switches.yaml, or again, the switches section of your configuration.yaml. So this is going to be a template switch. Check our indents. So we got platform template. We're defining the normal switches. The name of it is office overhead light. Value template. Now this is the value that our switch is going to use to determine if it's on or off. So in the UI, if you don't have this, then it's going to just blindly flip. You won't know what status it's in. So this is important because this is how we know if the device is on or off. So the value template is going to be just the sensor state of the office overhead light, which we defined right over here. So that's this one right here. So you need to make sure that that name matches this name here. And again, what Home Assistant does is it drops all the uppercase and adds an underscore between each space, and that's how you get the name for the switch here. So it's going to be the office overhead light, and if it's on. So the value template will be on if this sensor is got state of on. So the turn on command, we're going to reference that REST command we defined earlier on, this REST command right here, and we're going to send the following data device ID and command. If we look, that's the two fields that this needs. The command and device ID. So because this particular one doesn't have a parameter, since we're not sending it any type of values like color or position, then it's just going to ignore the parameters. It doesn't actually need that one. So if you're wondering why we're not sending a parameter data, it's because it's not necessary for this. So we're going to call the rest command, SwitchBot device command, and we're going to pass it the device ID from our secrets, and then we're going to send it the command turn on. Then for the turn off, it's the exact same thing, except for we're going to send the turn off command. Pretty simple, pretty easy. Save that, and of course check our configuration and restart. So to see if it works, let's go to developer. We'll check the sensor first. Sensor.office. So the office overhead light is on. So that matches what we saw in the API call. So let's look for switch, and there we go. So we can see it thinks that the light is currently on because that's what it's pulling from. Now, one thing of note, just like it is in the app, it's not going to be an instantaneous command. A lot of times when you hit the app, it gives you a little circle and it spins to say, hey, I'm thinking about it. Because it is Bluetooth and it's not connected 100% of the time, you may issue a command and it may just kind of sit there and not do anything. So this is one of those instances you may have to do it twice. And another item is because we only check the status every 5 minutes, we're not going to get that instantaneous refresh. So it's probably a better idea to set each of these buttons to a lower value. So when you do actuate them within a minute, you get the current status of the device. So that's it for a switch. So that's for every bot. So a standard bot. Now, if you're doing this with a push button instead of the switch mode, obviously it's never going to sit in the state of on unless it's running. So you may turn on the switch and it'll run and then turn right back off again. So don't be concerned if it stays in the off position. Obviously, you won't really know it's running until you hear the coffee grinder running or whatever it happens to be. All right, so for the last major section here, let's go through how to set up the humidifier. All right, so for the humidifier, we're gonna pop back over to our Visual Studio Code. And again, just like before, our most important part of this is the sensor. So let's go ahead and grab our humidifier code. So again, platform is REST, name is Twins Room Humidifier. We're gonna hit that humidifier status URL endpoint. It's a GET every 300 seconds, same authorization, same API key. Under value template, now instead of pulling the body.temperature, we're gonna pull body.power. So this way we know if the humidifier is on. This is the primary value for that specific value template. We care mostly about the power on the humidifier. Obviously, you could set any of these attributes as your main attribute or as your main value if you wanted to. So for the body, we're going to pull in information, and let me show you real quick. Let's look at what that looks like. And there we go. Now it executed. So it pulls down its a humidifier. We see different values, one called nebulizer efficiency, humidity, auto, child lock, sound, power, temperature, and lack water, which would be running out of water. So what we really care about, so we're pulling the main value is going to be this power. Is it on or off? That's there. And then the other attributes, humidity, temperature, efficiency, auto, child lock, sound, and lack water. We're pulling all those keys out and we're going to put them as attributes. So when we restart, we'll have all these additional attributes pulled out of there as well. Now, obviously for things like temperature, this is going to come out in Celsius. If you want it in Fahrenheit, you'll need to create a separate sensor that pulls this attribute data and converts it into the proper value you want. So then for control, this one's a little bit more difficult. Under control, if we bring up the API documentation, so here we are at the API information on GitHub. And if we scroll down to the command set for physical devices section, we'll see all the different commands that we have for each physical device. For humidifier, you have 3 different types of commands. You have turn off, turn on. Then you also have this one called set mode, which allows you to set it for auto, 1, 2, or 3. So 101, 102, or 103, or you can set a percentage 0 to 1. If you wanted to, you could either set this up with a drop down of either auto, 1, 2, or 3, or you could use a slider. In my case, I'm going to go ahead and set up a drop down. So we're going to head back to Visual Studio Code. And again, we already have the humidifier sensor set up. Now let's get the humidifier switch set up to turn on and off. In this case, I'm going to set this up fairly simplistically. I'm going to set up a switch that will turn it on and off, and then I'll have an automation where if you change the status of that drop down, it's going to pass that variable on to your humidifier. So this may not be the most efficient way of doing it, but this is just an example to show you how to use this. So again, for switch, let's make a copy of our existing one. Call this one Twins Humidifier and replace our spaces with underscores. So again, we care about the status. We're pulling the power variable, whether it's on or off, and then we can leave the rest of these the same, except for we need to change this to the secret matching the other device. So this is just called humidifier. Oops. So this would be SwitchBot, humidifier. So again, make sure these keys match the key you have defined in your secrets.yaml. So now we've got the basics. We can turn it on and off. All of our entities ready to go. So go to developer tools and we're gonna look for switch.humidifier. So look for switch.twins humidifier. So it's currently off, so we can turn it on or off here if we wanted to, and that'll power on the humidifier. Again, there's gonna be a bit of a delay here because it has to pull that information down every 5 minutes, 60 seconds, whatever it happens to be. So now that we got the basic sensor set up, I was gonna go ahead and show you how to set up an automation to do the humidifier controls, but that's just gonna become too complicated and make this video already is too long. So I've got those in the blog post. If you care about that specific setting, you can get that out of the blog post. But we have our minimum control for our twins humidifier. We can now see if it's on or off, and then we can use the switch to turn it on and off, which is probably good for most people. So we can go ahead and turn that off, and then we'll go over here to the command line, and now it's off. So we have full control over it. We have all of our censored values being pulled out of it. So if you want to figure out how to set those different modes using automation, I've got example code in the blog post for that. So now that's the three main devices that I have: push buttons, the meters, and the humidifiers. Now I did say at the beginning of the video that I was going to do something on the hubs, but again, that is so different between what you are doing and what everybody else is doing. So again, I've got example code in the blog post on how to send those commands over the API. It's very similar to what we're doing here right now. The difference is you're going to, instead of calling the Bluetooth device ID, you're going to call the specific virtual device ID, which is a bit longer. And then you need to figure out what specific command you want to send. So if we look over here at the code, there's a whole section right here under command set for virtual infrared devices. So just like we sent the command turn on or turn off, we could send the command set channel, and then you could send a channel number. If you want to say turn it on, it's turn on, turn off. If you want to turn up the volume, it's volume add. If you want to turn it down, it's volume sub. So you see, you just send those particular commands so you can map a button in Home Assistant to that. So if that's something you want to see, let me know in the comments below, and I will make a separate video on that. It's just too complicated already enough with this video as it is. So there you go. I hope this was helpful. I know we got into some pretty technical details there on the second half, but that's how this system works. There's not a direct integration for the API yet. I hope that there will be one made soon, so this becomes a little bit easier. But this is a great opportunity for you to dive into what you can do if you have an API set up for another particular device. So again, this is another exploration into APIs. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, let me know in the comments below. If you do run into problems, you can go to this link here below to go to our Discord channel. And of course, as always, please make sure you give this video a thumbs up if this was helpful to you, and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Now, if you'd like to see more videos on APIs, you can click on this playlist right here, or if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel by clicking our logo above. Thanks again. Have a great rest of your week. Happy holidays and Merry Christmas.